Welcome to The Conversation, a chance for some dialogue about issues pertaining to race and racism in our country, in the world, here on Cape Cod. I'm Will Mebane, one of the hosts of this show here, as always, with, I always want to say, like Vanna White, the lovely Onjalé Scott Price or something, right? But with co-host and co-producer Antonucci Scott Price, and we're glad that you have joined us. Oh, we have a show for you today. There's lots going on in the world, and some of it is related to what we're going to talk about today, including the international events unfolding. Our focus, though, primarily is on racism in curriculum, curriculum that shows up in public schools, primary schools, secondary schools, colleges and universities. There's been all this talk about and laws now being passed in legislatures all around the country forbidding the teaching of anything about race or racism. And so we're going to explore that today. We have two very prominent individuals as our in-studio guests today, joining us via Zoom as we continue to protect ourselves during the pandemic. And we've got some folks also with some powerful comments from on the street. And we're going to go to them right now as they address the first question, which is, how does racism influence what is taught in classrooms? So let's hear what they have to say.
So I'm really lucky as an English teacher that I have a lot of freedom in what texts I can teach. So I've been able to work with my colleagues in the English department to really diversify the texts that we're using and the authors that we're using. And that's been one of the ways that we've tried to start to address the canon as it was handed to us, which was a lot of traditionally white Christian older men, right? And we've had a huge amount of support from FEF, Falmouth Education Foundation, in supporting giving us funds to be able to bring new texts into the classroom. So that's been really a really great way to address the racism that kind of gets handed to us when we pick up our textbooks or our traditional texts.
You know, the curriculum in most classrooms is a reflection of the people who are curating it ultimately, whether that is the folks responsible for state standards or an elected school board or the AP or even an individual classroom teacher. And all of us come to that curating process with a certain bias, conscious bias, unconscious bias. And, you know, sometimes those biases are explicit and, you know, in service of promoting an agenda like social stability or reifying established power structures. But more often they're kind of implicit and unconscious and informed by our own backgrounds, our own educational experiences. What we might have been taught ourselves is kind of good or true. And because to varying degrees, we've all been marinating in, you know, in a society that's replete with racial injustice, it really does take conscious acts and high degrees of self-awareness to not teach in ways that reinforce biases or advance our particular interests or our worldviews. So that's not surprisingly, you're going to find classrooms that are to varying degrees informed by, you know, our unconscious biases or our blind spots.
Well, that should get us started on our conversation today about race and racism in the classroom. We're now joined by two distinguished individuals with incredible backgrounds in the field of education, neither which I think needs much introduction to this community, but I will share a little bit about their backgrounds as we go on. But Dr. Seyana Mawusi is with us, and also Dr. Robert Antonucci. And glad to have you back. They have been on the show before, so we are now show number 18, and we didn't get canceled when you were on. So
we set the stage for you. What else do you want? That's it. All right.
Well, we've got a heavy topic. This is so much, as I said in the introduction, so much going on in the world. But in this country, there's what I would describe as an attack on education. We've got state legislatures all across this country passing bills, legislation saying you can't teach this in schools, you can't use this word in school, you can't make people feel bad with what you're teaching. So I'm hoping you are going to help me and our viewers understand what is going on. But first, I want to see what responses you had to what Liz and Matt had to say from on the street in response to the question, how does racism influence what is taught in the classroom? Either responding to them or any other thoughts you might want to share. Let's start with you, Seyana.
I think, just watching people, but just hearing conversations in general, hearing things on TV, hearing things, it's disturbing. It's disturbing that I want to know where we think we're going and what we hope to accomplish by marginalizing, or I'm going to say remarginalize. I don't even think there's such a word. Remarginalizing people in the community. It's almost in a way, and this is my opinion, I just feel sometimes we are being punished for taking a stand, growing, learning, doing everything that we need to do. And then all of a sudden they changed the rules when a lot more people voted last year. Well, not last year, but in the last presidential election, people being mobilized, people understanding, people speaking out more. And I think some people are very afraid of that situation. And the best way they can be to maintain their own power is to take power away from everybody else and not letting you identify yourself, not letting you talk about your history, not letting you just be true to who you are, takes your power away, makes you powerless.
You're muted, Rev.
Thank you. Bob, I know you've spent time as on several levels of education. You were Commissioner of Education here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You were Superintendent of Schools here in Falmouth, College President, University President, and President Emeritus at Pittsburgh State University. So you've seen this, as I said, on many levels. And, one of the things Matt said in his response was, racism is maintained through the textbooks that we have and what is taught in the classroom. And by way of full disclosure, I'm a former chairman of a school committee, Board of Education over in a community in Connecticut where I lived for 30 years. So let me get your take, Bob, on how do we perpetuate this teaching of racism in schools?
Again, if you listen to teachers, and that was Matt and Liz, and when I was commissioner, I always made the statement that real education and real teaching is in the classroom between the teacher and students, no matter who's the commissioner, no matter who the governor is, no matter who the superintendent is. So it's that classroom that really, to me, is the focal point for anything to happen. And I think we heard this from both Matt and Liz talking about teaching, all right? Comments like teachers come to the classroom with a bias, maybe because of their background, maybe because of the way they were taught. I don't think any teacher is doing anything intentional not to include racism in a curriculum, but because of their own background, sometimes they don't know how to do it. So the what is pretty easy, in my opinion. When I was commissioner, we did state standards in all the academic areas. They're still in place today. And embedded in those standards a talk about racism and diversity and inclusion, whether it be race, gender, or sexuality, whatever it is. And it's embedded throughout all of the curriculums. Whether that is successful depends on the teacher. And I think teachers traditionally, I'm going to give them credit, have done an exceptional job. I think Matt made the comment about textbooks and the way textbooks were written. And some teachers are still using those textbooks, which really didn't handle racism in the way that it should be. So I think what we need to do as educators and as former school board members is to let teachers become more actively involved in how do we deal with this. We need to keep the politicians out of it. If I have my knee operated on, I'm not going to ask the senator from Massachusetts how that should be done. Yet they feel they can tell schools how it should be done. Nobody can preach like you can preach. Should we have a senator come in to preach? No, don't answer that question. But the issue is leave it to the experts. I mean, I don't think there's any teacher that doesn't want to do the right thing. And historically, we have done the right thing. Have we made some mistakes? Yes, we have. No question about it. I'm a first generation person. My father was born in Italy. And I look back through the ages. Were there some mistakes made in discriminatory practices? Probably. But it doesn't mean we can't do the right thing today. And not to prohibit schools from talking about racism from a political level or from gay and homosexuality, any of those issues is wrong. The interference in how schools are run and the interference in how students are taught is definitely wrong. Should parents be involved? Yes, they should be. They have been for many years. But at the same time, there has to be this coalition of what's best for students in classrooms at a very young age. It can't be superimposed on them. It really has to be embedded, as I said earlier, in all of the curricula in all our schools.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about what you said, Bob, and again, remembering my days working with administrators and as a member of the school board. And I learned then, which I didn't know, is that most of our textbooks originate out of Texas. At least they did then. And I see you both nodding, and so that must still be the case today. And then I think about, my goodness, what's happening in Texas on many levels in dealing with cultural, social issues. That's, for me, that's kind of frightening that those are the people in power that are influencing what is going to be in the textbooks that are then distributed all across the country. But I want to challenge you on one thing, Bob. You said you don't think there are teachers in the classroom that come with bias, racism, you know. I want to challenge that because, again, in my experience as both a parent of students in school, two black sons in elementary, secondary schools, and working with coaches and other administrators and faculty in schools. No, I've run across some school teachers who were just outright racist. So I appreciate the thought. I'd like to believe that we don't have biased, racist teachers, administrators in our schools, but I think we have some. What do you say to that?
We definitely do. We have some college professors. We have some K-12 teachers. We have some administrators. That's a very accurate statement. And I think we need to address those issues. And sometimes when I say bias, it's a positive bias. I think, and I'm going to say most teachers want to do the right thing. I really do. They want to do the right thing for students. But there are those in every profession that really, in my opinion, shouldn't be in the classroom. Because you need to deal with every single child who knocks at our door, whether they're black, white, green, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, non-denominational. And, I think back years ago at an in-service program when we were really trying to talk about diversity and inclusion. To some people that was new, and it shouldn't be new. I mean, to me, it was just embedded in the way I grew up. And we would have these in-service programs, And it was frustrating because I could tell you who would sit in the last row of the auditorium every time we had this program. And if we sprinkled racial bias dust over them, we couldn't get inside their head. But that was a minority, and we knew who those were, you know. But for the most part, we did this when I was commissioner. We did state standards, and the state began to impose what should be taught in schools. All right, that was a change. We worked with teachers, and I tell you, if it weren't for the teachers in this Commonwealth who stepped up to the plate, we wouldn't be where we are today. We're #1 in the country academically in terms of that, because they were involved. And so I think if we identify a problem, then we need to address it, and how do we resolve it? And we got to work together to do it. It isn't a blame game. I think politicians blame. It's not blame. We just need to identify the problem and work toward solving it.
Yeah, I love what Liz had to say. I'm going to come to you, Seyana. I love what Liz said about the freedom that she has, and she was celebrating this to be able to integrate into her curriculum as an English teacher, you know, what she can teach. And so she doesn't. So we have the state standards and the curriculum that's developed and by the school system and all, but she still has this freedom, and that's being taken away from so many educators. And Seyana, you were, as I said, an educator on many different levels, and middle school, college, and what have you. So what are you thinking?
You know, there's, I think the problem is much deeper sometimes than we look. Yes, teachers get a chance to, because I've been on a textbook committee. We get a chance to look at textbook committee, but what gets to be put in is still not always that which will solve the problems. When we talk about the history of Africans or the histories of indigenous people, sometimes even that information is marginally put in a textbook. So you might get this little bit in, but does that do anything to change how people think and feel? I do think textbooks, I do definitely think teachers bring their own biases to the classroom and work. And I'm not saying that all teaching is bad, but I think when we have this discussion about bias and what we need to teach, we need to also look historically. What is it that we really want people to know, and what's the outcome? What will be the outcome of what we teach? And let's look at the outcomes of what we're teaching now. Let's look at the outcomes of what we teach if we really make a program workable. I know a lot of places don't even do old civics. You know how you remember you said learn about your government and this person, this, that, this
7th grade,
that, and everything. And that's all whole different attitude and way it's taught now. I think we have to really decide what we want from our students. Do we want them to pass the test? Do we want them to be wonderful human beings? Do we want this to be an inclusive society? That's what we have to begin to really look at. And when you leave people out, you've already started exclusive society where we're going to exclude people because we're going to leave out your history. We're going to leave out your identity. We're just going to leave you out. We're not going to count and consider you. So I'm hoping that discussions just won't be, okay, if we're going to really talk about what we're doing, I'm hoping we're going to look at the outcome and really do a deep dive into history and what we are really saying every day to students in schools.
I appreciate you mentioning the lack of civics being taught in class, in the classroom. That was one of my favorite subjects. It was one of the few subjects I got a good grade in, and then all of a sudden they took it away, you know. But then I was like, I wonder if you could draw a correlation. I would love maybe some doctoral student candidate would do this work. Is there a correlation between the lack of teaching civics in the classroom and the decline in voter participation in this country? That just came to me.
Yeah. Well,
that would be an excellent study, or even participation, period.
Civic
Learning
participation.
civics. And we can all, civics is just learning these facts, but would I know if I had this much power? Would I maybe sit back and not do anything? What about groups of people? And I think we have to figure out, when we do that, we exclude people. So then we hear crazy stuff on TV and we don't know whether it's right or wrong because we never have any knowledge to put towards that. So I'm concerned about what's being taught and what's the message.
Yeah, the sad point about that is, along with Will, is there are still programs with civics, but not to the extent. I said seventh grade because every seventh grader when I went to school took civics. That was it. Everybody knew what that was going to be. What worries me now about schools in the civic piece especially is they're getting all of their information about what civics really is from television and from social media. And what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Florida, is really not what the fundamentals of this country were built upon. That's the civics we don't want them to know about. Discourse is fine. I'm not saying discourse isn't going to occur. There probably occurs at selectmen's meetings when you have difference of opinions, and that's good, a little bit, right? But it's civil discourse. What we're seeing here in terms of a foundation is not good. I mean, I think the U.S. Senate yesterday, for the very first time in many years, had a unanimous vote to change daylight savings time. Well, that's the biggest issue in this country, and yet we have people being killed and shot at in the Ukraine, and yet they come together on that. And something wrong about that picture. But the four of us, I don't think, can resolve that in this program.
Well, I want to hear what someone from a different generation from ours has to say on this. Let's bring in Onjalé and ask her to weigh in, because you went to schools, lots of different schools, and so you had lots of different experiences. What are you holding?
Yeah. For some context, I switched schools every year from 2nd grade to 10th grade.
Oh my gosh.
I skipped the 4th grade, but every other year I was at a different school. That is a much longer story, not necessarily for this show. But
that'll be show 19.
Yeah, I can do a whole show on that. And so I have a very interesting perspective, having gone to so many different schools, public schools, private Christian schools, a magnet school, which I think is kind of like a charter school.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been to a lot of different schools. And one thing I can say is, as an adult, some of the books that I'm reading, such as Lies My Teacher Told Me, I'm reading Caste, I just finished Color of Law, and I'm like, I knew none of these things. I can tell you, I did not hear the phrase Reconstruction until I was in college. Like, Reconstruction era never came up when I was in school. All we learned about Native Americans was the Trail of Tears. It was like, it was almost as if, oh, this terrible thing happened once. We, as the country, moved some Native American people once, and that was it. There was never any more real discussion about anything to do with Native Americans. It was Martin Luther King was really good, and Malcolm X not so good, but so very basic things that I think, unfortunately, as an adult, I'm having to essentially unlearn some of these really basic, I don't know what you call them, like castes of people, understanding that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X had differing views, but they had the same goal. And it's not that one was bad and one was good. It was that they just had a different way of doing things, but they had a common goal. But those kinds of things were not taught in school, but I learned a whole lot about European culture and the early part of the Americas from the colonizer perspective. And I don't think that it unfortunately has changed very much. So it's almost like I feel it's up to myself now to go to Eight Cousins or Footprints bookstore and buy all these books to learn the actual history, because I didn't get any of that in school. So, but one person or one thing I think about often is Jane Elliott, the teacher who did the infamous blue eyes, brown eyes experiment in her classroom. And I think that is a testimony to a teacher being able to say, I don't maybe have the resources to teach out of these books, but there is something that my students need to learn. And so I'm going to figure out how to teach them. And I know that was huge controversy when she did it, but we look back at that now and, well, I look back at that now and think that was brilliant. That was so amazing for her to think of doing something so relatively simple that has such an impact. I've seen the interviews of those people who are now, much older and talking about how they remember the impact that simple exercise had on them for the rest of their lives. And I think that is a really good example of how teachers can really take hold of their classrooms and make a difference in their classrooms.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It relates back to that textbook issue that we speak about. And again, I worked in a publishing arena for a few years, so I know a little about that. Why Texas has so much influence is because they have state mandated textbooks. They're approved by the State Board of Education. They're the biggest customer of the entire country when it comes to the purchase of textbooks. So publishers traditionally use the basic standards of Texas to develop these textbooks, which we then bought in Massachusetts and California. And I think that's changed now as the textbooks become more, online kind of issues. But that was the influence, but that went on for years. I mean, you bought a series of, say, U.S. history, and that's an 8th grade thing. You buy U.S. history 8th grade text. The Texas influence, as Mel mentioned, was definitely there. Florida's influence was there. Again, New York to a degree because of the number of students. So there was that influence that we need to overcome. And I think that's changed a little today. But I also think if you look at this country, if you look at the Northeast where we all are today versus the South and Southwest, there's a big difference of opinion about whether racism should be even mentioned in school. And that's why programs like this are so valuable, to say it has to happen. And the roadmap to make it happen is going to be very difficult. And we got a lot of bumps to overcome.
And I think something that Onjalé mentioned is so critical is that the history that you learned, but a lot of people who are teaching learn the same history, learn the same non-history and the same history that you taught. We don't know a lot of different history, even though it's out there. And just like you did different readings and to find different things. And I'm not sure. And even as you look at what they're trying to legislate now for people that can teach, I'm wondering, will Jane Elliott's teaching style and thinking and being creative, how far that will go? But I'm still concerned that history is still nowhere near as accurate as it needs to be for all peoples, because everybody's history is included in the history. And so I really feel that we have not done a good job, and it has not changed that much. We're still fighting over words, whether we're going to say enslaved or slaved.
Yeah.
We're still, that argument is still there. And I think as we approach and look at this reality of what we're doing, we have to be honest and say how many people still feel that history and what they need to know did not come from their education. And what are we, again, what is the purpose? Why?
I think I'll pass it back to you in a second, Rev. I think your question of why and what do we want the future to look like, and almost like backtrack is like, what do we want the future to look like, and then how do we get there? If we want the future to look like it's been looking, with the same people in power, with the same people oppressed, with the caste system that we have, with the way things are, then we're going to keep doing things the same way. And so if we say we want our future to look different than the way our past has been, then we know we need to do something differently. What is the definition of insanity? Is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. Yeah.
Right. So this discussion is making me think, well, to just go back to the original question, it was how does racism influence what is taught in schools? And when I hear you, Bob, talk about you were in the publishing arena for a bit, and hearing Seyana talk about who's controlling what is being taught in the classroom, and so once again we find ourselves in this in this place where it sounds to me like one of the reasons racism continues to make itself into textbooks, into curriculum, is because those who are in the dominant culture still in this country, the majority white country, that not for long, but people who are in charge of the publishing companies are white. The people who are in charge of school boards, for the most part, are white.
Mhm.
People who are, superintendents of schools are mostly white. We have the same issue in just about every industry, every sphere in this country. I can't remember if it was Liz or Matt that talked about racism being endemic. It's just a part of this nation. It's part of the country. And I know, I think I remember, Matt saying that to change that, you have to make a conscious effort to change it, right? You just can't leave it or wish that it's going to change, hope that it's going to change, pray that it's going to change. You've got to take some action to change that paradigm, right? To change the power structure that continues to have a hold on what is taught. And if the people in that power have racist views or bias in any way, that's going to continue to find its way into what finds its way onto the kitchen tables of
Right.
children all around the country, doing homework.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
no, go ahead. I'm just thinking out loud.
You know, when you talk about we have to find a way and what do we have to stop. I know sometimes, and I don't know whether it's happened here, but in California, a lot of people were starting to teach people, like they would have Hebrew school, that the Vietnamese children would go to school at a certain time. Even Greek children going to keep their history and their religion or whatever it was alive because it wasn't going to be taught in the public schools. You hate to say things like that, but I'm concerned now about what is going to happen to African history. It's already controversial. And where will it be and how will it end up? Are we now, in order to make a change, are we absolutely saying that we're going to have to teach African history over here at the church, or are we going to have to teach different people so everybody gets a chance to hear? I don't know how we stop and change a system that has been in place for years and years and years and years. And so I don't know, but I think we all have a disservice if we're not going to teach and talk about things that are helpful and relevant to the child sitting in that classroom or parents in that community. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned, where do we go? And I'm also concerned, how do we change it? And the question I have even, are we willing to change it?
Hmm.
I think that
Well, yeah, you should be concerned, okay? And I'm more concerned about education today than when we did Ed Reform in '92, because there was an excitement. And I don't know if you were in the Commonwealth then, and people all came together from all different places to make things happen. To answer your question, I think in Massachusetts, we're going to make it happen. I think we've been very progressive in our schools. We have a long way to go. In Texas and in Florida, I'm not sure it's ever going to happen again. I see what's happening in those. Don't mean to single out those two states, and I apologize if people were born in those states. But from an educational point of view, I wouldn't send my kids to school in Texas or Florida. When you can't mention racism, or you can't mention religious affiliation or gender, there's something wrong with that picture. And the way politicians are dictating, what's happening in schools. It's not only schools, it's voting rights. It's, how do we get minorities to get on school boards if we're passing these voting bills that really don't guarantee equality for all? And so I think, we're not there. I look back to the 60s, again, there was an excitement that, you know, people jumped up in arms and said, let's change. And have we made our way? We haven't. I think we're taking steps backwards, you know, as a society when it comes to race and when it comes to gender and when it comes to discrimination and inclusion. And I think that's wrong. But we can't sit back and let it happen. My point is, and you listen to those, to Liz and Matt, they got it all together. They know what the issue is, and we just got to take that and take that enthusiasm and that kind of thinking to a far greater level.
You know, I'm hearing a maybe a contradiction that's going on in our country right now. On the one hand, there is this in almost every, again, institution, for-profit, non-profit, this interest in and this commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? DEI, that's the big thing right now. Everybody's, and you know, the two of you are high-paid consultants, so I'm sure you're being hired out a lot to help systems with that. So on the one hand, we've got that going on. And then on the other hand, we've got people saying, no, we don't need to be concerned about diversity and equity and inclusion. No. We're going to legislate that out. You can't, there's not a diversity, that's a bad thing. You got to get rid of, no. And so it's a contradiction, right? And Bob, some of my best friends live in Florida and Texas. But I don't mind you calling those states out because of the decisions that are made by the politicians there. And so, you know, what I heard again Matt say was, you know, the politicians, the people in power, they're afraid. They're afraid of losing their power, right? So one way to hold on to that power is to suppress anything that's going to obviously possibly threaten that. And in their minds, diversity, equity, and inclusion threatens that. But here's the question I want to ask you before we're going to go to our next question, unless Anji has a comment or question. For both of you, so you lots of years in the classrooms and different different responsibilities, what have you. My belief is the students in the classroom, they aren't threatened by any of that. They're not threatened by learning about diversity. They're not threatened by learning about racism or what really happened to the indigenous populations. That's not a threat to them at all. It's the, again, people in power that feel threatened. And you know, I've been thinking about what's happening in the world in terms of Russia invading Ukraine, and you know, Putin is trying to rewrite history. He is trying to say, you know, that Ukraine is a neo-Nazi government, and I mean, some of this off the wall stuff, right? And he's got millions of people believing him and following him. And so he's going to suppress anything that is going to contradict that, right? Boy, isn't that the same thing that's happening in this country? We've got people in power, political power, who are going to suppress the true history and not allow students to be able to learn what the real history is of this country. Slavery is an historical fact. Jim Crow, an historical fact. Anji mentioned Reconstruction, an historical fact. You got to teach this. Anyway, Anji, you have a comment before we go to the
Jim Crow was another thing that was very briefly mentioned in my history textbooks in the many schools that I went to. Again, I went to lots of different schools. And I remember when I actually learned about Jim Crow, again, in college and afterwards, and reading, like I said, The Color of Law and The New Jim Crow, reading that book and really understanding the history. And I remember thinking how ridiculous it was that I thought Jim Crow was just a synonym for like separate water fountains. Like I really just did not learn the deep roots of Jim Crow and what it actually meant in the South, which of course I wouldn't have learned because I didn't learn about Reconstruction either. And those kind of, they go hand in hand. So we have a lot of work to do.
We do, and I'm glad we have Dr. Bob Antonucci to help us with that, and Dr. Seyana Mawusi help us with that as well. So listen, why don't we shift over to our people on the street, because they're going to answer the second question of the conversation, and that is how and or why should the history of racism be taught in schools? How and why should the history of racism be taught in schools? Let's hear what they have to say, and then we'll come back and get your reactions to it. All right?
The why, I think, as we've been discussing, is, at the risk of being cliche, pretty obvious, right? Those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. So my thought is that if, by honestly confronting racism, and it doesn't have to necessarily just be here in the United States, black and white, but racism whenever and wherever it has occurred, you have a better chance of graduating students who are better positioned to break the cycle. The adult whose experience in history class leads them to say, gosh, I didn't know that happened, or I didn't think that happened, is probably going to be more likely when considering their own society to say, gosh, I don't think that happens, or that probably doesn't happen. The how is so much trickier. So the why to me is reasonably clear. Ideally you'd be in a school or a classroom that had a rich diversity of voices, that all felt kind of equal access to the class, to power, and we're studying a rich diversity of resources. But as I said, at least for the time being, our classes tend to be a little more homogenous. So I guess on the how front, I would say, I think it's probably two things. And one is, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but the first is that I think there's a risk in looking to your BIPOC students to do all of the heavy lifting when it comes to talking about the history of racism. And when it comes to our white students, I think it's also important to not emphasize that what has happened or what is happening is anyone's particular fault, but that it is our shared responsibility. I think in the end, when you study the history of racism, you really are, from just a pure skills point of view, digging into the second tier thinking skills that all of our schools espouse, say that we're doing, right? Critical thinking and problem solving. And so a class that was having a very healthy examination of the history of racism, I think by necessity would be a class that was engaging in problem solving and critical thinking skills. And so on one front, you may ultimately do some significant social good, but along the way, you're also developing some academic and intellectual, some academic skills and habits of mind that are going to serve all kids, wherever they head.
I don't see a reason why we wouldn't teach it. I don't see a good reason why we wouldn't teach it. But I think if you're asking me, like, what would I say to someone who would not want the history of racism to be taught? I think that there's a lot about that history that is uncomfortable, particularly for white teachers and for white students. And there's a fear of being uncomfortable. I think a reason that people push back against teaching the history of racism is that it really calls into question our structures of power and who has that power and who has access to that power, and how that power allows people to self-perpetuate their access to the power. And I think that, you know, the other thing I would say is that, well, we're already teaching the history of racism, whether we like it or not, because racism is embedded in our society, and it's a, you know, white cultural norms are a huge part of how we are taught, how we were taught as students, and how we are taught by media to view our students, and all kinds of, it's, you know, it's in everything that we do. So we can either be academic about how we teach the history of racism, or we can be complacent. And if we're going to be academic about it, then we can really self-assess and work on our own understanding of it, and get, you know, get to the facts with the students, or we can be complacent about it and we can teach them the lies that have been a part of our education or our society in general. But I don't think people like to believe that you don't want to believe that you've been taught a lie, but you definitely don't want to believe that you've believed a lie. And that's a big part of why people are afraid about teaching the truth of racism, both in the history and the present.
Well, wow. I told you folks, we have been educated. We've got two powerful voices from our On the Street segment today. Thank you to Matt and to Liz. You've given us a lot to think about. A lot is on my heart right now, but I want to see what our panelists have to say in response to this how and or why, you know, we should teach racism in the schools. Bob, I want to start with you. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you know, Matt makes a good point. I think he asked the question, you know, how does racism influence what is taught, okay, and how it's taught? So there are two things. I always broke this down. It's the how and the why. The why, in my opinion, is very easy. It should happen. It's a given program. It's a given thinking. It's a given curricula. But it's how it's taught is the question. That's what makes the difference. We did this with ed reform. We can identify all the standards that should be included in school, but we have to understand, how do we do that? How do we influence third graders? How do we influence eighth graders? And how do we influence high school seniors? And I think that's where we need to do a lot of work. I think it's happening. You see a lot of schools getting involved in professional development, but we have to have people, I hate to say this, who know what they're talking about, you know, in terms of how do we influence teachers. Teachers are very receptive. Teachers want to do better. I was a teacher. I wanted to do better. If I want some help, I want to get the right help. So I think where our influence has to be, or our impact, is how do we do this? You know, and I think we use people like Liz and Matt to get there. I mean, you get teachers who know, believe, and have tried it to be the one that influences as we move ahead.
Yeah, as I was listening to them, I was thinking, how fortunate are we to have them in our community?
Oh, it's great.
It's
Yeah.
as having the two of you as well, and I'm not.
Yeah. No, they were great.
I mean that very sincerely. You know. So, Dr. Mawusi, tell us your response to that question. What's on your mind?
A lot. and it's I'm not sure we totally understand why we have to teach it. I don't think we really understand is why we have to teach about race, other people's culture, other people's history. I'm not sure we really do. I think we do at some level, but deep down inside, we're not. So it makes how a very hard part. And if we look historically back, it was against the law to teach Africans that were brought to this country to read. You could get in trouble for teaching people to read. There's a reason why for that. It wasn't just, oh, I just decided nobody should read. Because if you begin to read, you begin to understand, begin to teach yourself, and something in you would say, this isn't right.
Amen.
I was going to say you're preaching now. Okay.
Yeah.
And well, the reason why I'm looking at that, if you go back and you just look at our recent history of the elections, How many people got out to vote? How many people got involved in the election? Look what happened in Georgia, where they were hoping that the Republicans got in and then the Democrats got two of their people in for the Senate. This people are looking at this and people are deciding, whoa, wait a minute. So I think there's a lot of question of what happens when you absolutely give everybody a sense of self. And when you give people a sense of self, people want more, they think better, critical thinking, just like Matt said, absolutely. If we can begin to start and having children critically think even about if somebody doesn't want to say, well, this happened, but how did Africans get here? Suppose we don't talk about history, but we ask the questions and we do critical thinking. I think it's empowering, but we have to really stand firm and tall, because if not, I'm not sure how, but we also have to be very clear onto why we should do it. And I'm not sure, I'm hearing a lot of discussion, not from Matt and from Liz, but I'm talking about from the powers that be as to why.
Well, the powers to be, when they answer the question why, will say we don't need to do it.
Right, exactly.
That's the problem right there.
Yeah, that certainly is true. But they're kind of the obvious ones, right? That's sort of like, again, growing up in North Carolina, I had to deal with the Klan, and then I had to deal with the people who were racist that wore, three-piece suits every day. And so I knew where the Klan stood, they were just going to tell me,
You didn't know where the
how
others
they felt. But it was the other folks that were I had to worry about and were doing more of the damage. So I think, and I keep mispronouncing your name, Seyana, so maybe I just call you Seyana instead of Dr. Mawusi. Do we really want to do this?
Yes,
I mean, do we really want to do this? Because once you start telling the truth, once the truth comes out, people's eyes start to open and they start to use their critical thinking skills. They begin to see the world a lot differently than maybe they have been taught, and maybe differently from what the powers that be, we keep saying, how they want them to understand the reality. So I think you've raised a very, very good question. Angie, what are you thinking?
I really keep reflecting on the last thing that Liz said, where she said people don't want to believe they were lied to, but most importantly, people don't want to believe that they believed a lie. And that just opens up a whole nother can of worms, because then people, as they should, but people are going to start questioning everything that they know to be true, or everything that they feel to be true. It just starts to unravel. In another book that I read, The Conversation, timely, great name, by Dr. Robert Livingston, he poses similar questions. Excellent book, by the way. This is not a shameful book plug. He poses the question about, if you were to go to the doctor and say, I have some sort of ailment, just give me whatever you gave the last guy. You wouldn't do that. You would want the doctor to understand your medical history and what you're feeling and what you might be allergic to, and all of these things about you, to be able to move forward with the prognosis and with medication or whatever is necessary. And so learning our history is the same. How can we expect to move forward and do better if we don't understand how we got to where we are? If we don't understand what led us to this place, if we don't know the history, then we're never going to be able to really move forward. So those are the things that are on my mind.
Yeah, that's sort of like what Bob was saying in the beginning of the show. You're not going to, excuse me, you're not going to ask a senator if you need a knee replacement. You're not going to ask a senator to come in and replace your knee. So why are you going to ask a senator to tell the educators what ought to be taught in our schools? I think that's a very, very timely and very powerful analogy. But and the comment by Liz, I'm going to have to put that on a banner and put it behind something. I was like, wow, that is deep And that is so
Yeah.
right. That is
So
so true.
so right. Could
People
you?
don't want to believe a lie, but they don't want to believe that they were taught up. They don't, don't
They
want
Yeah.
to
don't want to
believe that they
believe
were
that they
taught a lie.
believe the lie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Want to
I
believe
think
it.
that's the critical part, because we can all believe that somebody has lied to us, but to believe that we fell for that lie and then built everything we know around said lies.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Maybe.
know I know just how I felt, like I said, reading books about Reconstruction and the true history of slavery and the removal of indigenous people from their land. I know how hurt I felt just knowing that I didn't get that information. So being on a different end of that, knowing that everything that I thought about why I deserved to have things or why other people were in different places, to find out that that was all a lie. I could see that being crushing, but
Hmm.
the truth has to come to light.
I once, what you said, Anjali, to that extent was also the same. To the other extent of that is, I remember when I was learning African history and learning about people, and the gentleman who was teaching me says, once you learn this, this will change your life.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I hear what you're stating about the different books and the things you're reading, what Liz is stating about people believing and lie, it will change your life. And that again is, do we want our lives changed?
Mm-hmm.
Does everybody want to change their lives? And one thing I do want to say before we talked about, Matt talked about that the white students don't have to feel upset. I think once we embrace diversity and truly embrace it, everybody has a history.
Yeah.
Everybody has some good things in their history. Everybody has some bad things in their history.
Yeah.
That's human nature. That's life. And I don't think we have to make anybody feel angry, but we don't have to cover it up and say it didn't happen either. But
Yeah.
I think we have to say this is not about making you feel bad. This is about all of us becoming free. That we don't have to carry that burden. So no, I don't think learning your history has to cut down or take another person totally out. I think we can still talk intelligently, do critical thinking, and we learn what it is so we don't repeat the same mistakes
Mm-hmm.
we're about to repeat if we don't do anything.
Can I
Yeah,
ask?
there's a saying in some place I heard this. The truth will set you free.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now
That
you're
sounds familiar.
yeah.
Yeah.
Bob, give us your thoughts. I know you're sitting with something there.
Yeah. No, I think, I think, yeah, it will change lives. But the one point I think is interesting is every ethnic group, every race has a history. And I think learning history is good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's how we do it and what we do with it. And it will make some people uncomfortable, but so what? The more uncomfortable you become, the more you open your mind and learn. And so I think as we move forward, I don't think we can say we can't. And I want to say we're not blaming anybody for this. All right. People did what they thought they were doing was right during the time they lived. All right. As we became more educated and as we became more civilized, we look back on things that should never have happened, and they're happening. So as long as we can open our minds to influence the decision makers to do the right thing, I think that's the first step that has to occur if we're going to see real change. Rather than putting up a poster, we need to get in the minds of people, and by their actions, they can make a difference.
Well, Bob, some of those people who were doing bad things knew they were doing bad things, and they did them anyway.
Oh, no question about it.
So,
Oh, how would you not?
Yeah.
If you rob a bank, you're robbing the bank,
Yeah,
right?
right,
I mean,
right.
there's no question. You got the gun, you got the mask, and you're asking for the money.
Yeah,
So,
right.
Yeah.
But I keep coming back to what I said just before the break, and it just came to me as we were talking about this comparison I'm making, at least in my mind, between Putin's Russia and what's happening here. Matt said those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it, right? So if we don't tell the history, take that to its extreme, which may not be that extreme, are we going back to enslaving people?
Yeah.
Are we going back to considering black people, 3/5 of a human being?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and how is that any different? So not wanting to teach that history, how is that any different from what Putin is doing? And forgive me for the soapbox for a moment. So everybody, most of us, or myself included, are horrified by what we're seeing happening in Ukraine, right? Absolutely horrified, and our hearts ache for the Ukrainian people and the refugees that have left. Um, it's just horrific. And yet, some of those politicians who are now saying, "Oh, we gotta go get Putin. We gotta, close the skies. We've gotta, you know, do whatever we can to defend and come to the aid of the Ukrainian people." Because Putin's telling a lie. He's not telling the whole truth. He's not telling people in Russia what's really happening in Ukraine. Well, if we don't teach history here, if we got politicians here saying, "Don't teach that. No, no, no,
You're right.
don't teach that. No, no, no." We're doing the same thing.
Pot calling kettle black.
I agree.
That's another saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've like I said, I've done a lot of reading, definitely in most recent years. And one thing I often think about is people read about tragedies of history. So someday, some children who are not here now are going to read about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine now. Same way we have read about the Holocaust and slavery. And it's very, very easy to say, oh, I would have done something. I would have done this or that. I would have been on the right side of history. And unfortunately, I don't think that's as true as we'd like to believe, because right now there's a lot of people who are going to be on the wrong side of history. But they would like to think that when they look back on other injustices happening, that they would be on the right side of history. So I hope, I don't know what my point is. I guess my point is, I hope that when people think about what can be done now, that they will think, what is the right side of history that I want to be on in the future? And what are the actions that I can take now to be on that right side of history?
Yeah. Good point.
Well, Matt was saying, I think this is where you started too, Bob, in coming out of that question. The question isn't, whether we should be doing it or not, or why we should be teaching about the racist history of this country. But the hard part is the how.
The how, right.
But Seyana, I'm still going to hold on to what you said about the big question is, why do we want to do it? And really, do we really want to do it? But I think the how question is if we agree that we should teach it, teach the real history, then the question becomes, how do you do that? And Liz was talking about all the other forces against which we have to fight in order to get the truth out, and whether that's media, the media and how they portray people of color and others. So there's a lot to fight through on this.
It is a lot to fight through. Back a couple of years, I started a school, an African-centered school, to teach history. To give everybody was talking about, at that time, a lot of African American students were being placed in special ed, different programs. They couldn't do this, they couldn't do that. And there's that part of me that just didn't believe that. And we started a school where we started teaching the African history. And I want to say those students that we taught are successful all the way up through and mostly went to college. And it wasn't a history of hate. We didn't teach them about hating anybody else, just celebrating who you are, celebrating that you have knowledge, and celebrating that you can learn, and that you have people who have contributed to the well-being. Everybody needs to hear that. Every ethnic group, we all need to say it, because we just didn't evolve. Everybody helped. And I think we have to say the history. And But I want to add one other thing that I look at history and I look at historical things. Just take the standardized test all across the country. It pans out the same. There's always more brown and black children in the lower proficient, not meeting it, than uh, children who are, white children, which tells us there's something inherently wrong. We're missing something. And that's another how. We have to look at that. Test scores across the country look the same.
I read somewhere that the people who make the SAT, whatever that terrible company is, they have done their own research that shows that the SAT is not, the scores in the SAT do not correlate to a student's success in college. It correlates to the income of their families.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we still require them. I mean, there are a lot of schools in recent years.
Yeah, most schools are now.
They're getting rid of it. But it took a while, even though we knew that it took a while, because it was still a barrier that could be upheld.
Yeah, Bob, you played in that arena for a while with standardized.
Yeah, we did, and and it's true. I think there's an influence. The family does influence, what happens. The SATs was really like a ticket to get into school, and now you're seeing that being dropped by the elite schools. Never mind the state schools, because I think there was a discriminatory aspect about that. And if you look at test scores across even Massachusetts, your urban areas where we have the highest concentration of minority students are the areas where we see lower test scores. So that's another whole program. What are we doing to help minority students get up to the level that they should be? And so they get out of that needs improvement category and become exemplary. And that's another story, but we need to do that. And it can't be through a test. I think there's a lot of bias in the language of a test. You get a Native American who grows up in a Native American family and tries to decipher some of the language that the questions contain. It's a barrier.
Yeah, the cultural bias that is in some
definitely.
of those questions, but yes, you're right. I am reading more and more about fewer and fewer schools requiring that or making the ACT or the SAT, the ticket to entry. And just one personal aside, I won't divulge my SAT scores, but they weren't good enough to get into the University of North Carolina, where I got my undergraduate degree, and certainly not good enough to get into Yale, where I got my master's. And
you're a better man for having done what you've done.
Well, but I think it proves the point. I think, and the same thing with our oldest son, SAT scores. Nobody wanted to admit him. Oh, he's got to go to a junior college, or he's got to go to a community college. Nothing wrong with that, but he got a master's from Yale. He now has his PhD. So the scores don't.
They don't mean anything.
They don't tell the story. You're absolutely right.
When you talked about having a correlation between civics earlier, when you were saying, let's look at, is there a correlation? Let's look at the correlation. If we were treating an all-inclusive history where I looked and I could look in the school and I could see me in the school, or everybody could see each other in the school, would that change?
Yes.
Then would that change?
Right.
That's a study that we also need to look at. Is also would that change? So there's a lot of questions that we have to really look at to make a difference for our students coming.
PSA to anybody out there who's a history major, philosophy interest, education major. If you're looking for a PhD thesis, we got you.
There it is.
Yes.
Yeah, somebody other than me, because I'm done.
Right.
Hey, listen, it's been great to have Dr. Seyana Mawusi with us, consultant with a stellar background in education, started at Luxor Academy out in California, and is now consulting and helping the Falmouth School District, I understand, with some challenges they're trying to overcome. Grateful for your presence, Dr. Robert Bob Antonucci, former school superintendent, former commissioner of education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, former president of Fitchburg State University. Thank you both for helping us with this conversation. It's been a great conversation. And Angie, always good to hear that younger perspective to things that you bring to the conversation.
Yeah.
Hope we keep it that way for a while.
My thanks to Matt Green and to Liz Liles for really some incredible contributions, as well as our people on the street today. That's it for episode 18 of The Conversation. We look forward to, God willing, having another opportunity to be engaged in conversation with you about issues around race and racism as they affect our world, and particularly here where we live in Falmouth. Thanks to FCTV, to Deborah Rogers, and to Alan Russell in particular for their help with today's show and always. So that's it. Until the next time. Bye for now.